Hello, and welcome to the VBAC Facts podcast. I'm Jen Kamel, VBAC Facts founder, and our focus since 2007 has been to provide accurate and objective information on vaginal birth after cesarean and repeat cesarean to parents, professionals, policymakers, and the court, so all decisions can be informed, ethical, and just. Today, we'll be talking about the VBAC calculator. We'll talk about its use, the science behind it, the impact of race and racism, having a prior cesarean for failure to progress, and BMI, as well as a couple studies which call into question the accuracy of the VBAC calculator. Specifically, these studies found that the VBAC calculator underpredicted VBAC odds. I'll also share the lived experience of some of our readers. Much of what I talk about today can be downloaded in a handout available at vbacfacts.com/calculator. I'll include the link in the show notes. So VBAC calculators have been embraced with open arms by some providers, whereas others reject them altogether. Who's right? Trying to predict who will have a VBAC is tricky. We know some individual factors, such as having a prior vaginal delivery, are associated with higher or lower VBAC rates. By combining various factors, VBAC calculators generate a percentage that represents the best guess for an individual's odds of having a vaginal birth after cesarean. But VBAC calculators, also called VBAC success calculators, are not always accurate and can create emotional baggage. Lower VBAC odds can result in disappointment, a loss in confidence, and a pressure from a provider to have a repeat, possibly unneeded cesarean. After all, no one can tell the future. The only way that any of us will know how an individual labor will play out is to observe it happen. On the other hand, VBAC calculators may be a valuable tool in helping patients make the best decision they can about how to plan to give birth. And ACOG's latest VBAC guidelines encourage obstetricians to use the calculators. So we're left with this question: how accurate are VBAC calculators? And how much should clinicians rely upon them to help advise pregnant parents? To answer this question, I first want to focus on a 2019 study by Harris and team. Harris examines the accuracy of VBAC calculators and gives us some insight into when VBAC calculators are most accurate and when they are not. This retrospective study of all labor after cesareans, which I'll refer to as LACs, that occurred from 2013 to 2016 at Duke University in the United States, was the first of its kind. It sought to measure how the actual VBAC rate among 404 planned VBACs compared to predicted odds. Predicted odds were generated by the three most commonly used VBAC calculators: Grobman 2007, Grobman 2009, and Metz 2013. So there are some key differences between these calculators. Each of them approach the prediction process with distinctly different data sets. The Grobman 2007 calculator relies on information that the provider collects at the first prenatal appointment, things like age, body mass index, race and ethnicity, specifically Black or Latinx, previous vaginal delivery, and history of descent or dilation arrest, aka failure to progress. The 2009 version builds upon the 2007 version, adding data providers collect upon hospital admission for labor, including gestational age at delivery, presence of hypertensive disease at pregnancy, effacement, dilation, station, and labor induction. Metz 2013 combines historical information, like a history of vaginal delivery and the reason for a prior cesarean, with information providers collect upon admission for labor, such as Bishop score, and combines those factors with BMI and maternal age. In the Harris study, 75% of those who planned a VBAC had one, which is consistent with the overall 60 to 80% reported VBAC rate. As we have seen in other studies, those who arrive at the hospital in spontaneous labor had significantly higher VBAC rates than those who were induced, 79% versus 66%. Additionally, over half who had a VBAC in this study had a prior vaginal delivery, and over 1/3 had a prior VBAC. Among the 191 that had a prior vaginal delivery, 86% had a VBAC this time, and 14% had a CBAC, which is what we call a cesarean birth after cesarean. Note that I use the term cesarean birth after cesarean rather than failed trial of labor or failed VBAC. I'm trying to insert more sensitive language into the conversation. Now, that language refers to someone who chose to labor after a cesarean and for whatever reason ended up having a repeat cesarean. And this is to distinguish that group from the group of individuals who opts to have a C-section before labor begins. About 1/3 of primary cesareans in the United States are due to labor arrest, which providers often refer to as failure to progress. 34% of the women in this study had a history of diagnosis of descent or dilation arrest, which accurately reflects failure to progress or FTP rates in the United States. The Harris study also reported that among those who had a VBAC, 29% had a history of labor arrest. Of those who had a cesarean birth in the study, 53% of them had a history of labor arrest. So you might think having a history of FTP means one is less likely to have a VBAC. However, 63% of the 137 women in the study with a history of labor arrest had a VBAC, and only 37% had another cesarean. When one checks the labor arrest box in the Grobman VBAC calculators, it negatively impacts predicted VBAC odds. But there's a twist. Research shows that just because someone had a cesarean for FTP doesn't mean that they actually met the criteria for the diagnosis. And I think I've talked about this study in practically every episode I've published so far. The reason is because this information impacts so many people in the US, given the prevalence of cesarean for failure to progress. So one study reported that half of those who had a cesarean for FTP after labor induction were not even 6 centimeters. In an effort to reduce the number of primary cesareans, ACOG released new labor arrest definitions in 2014. Labor arrest in the first stage now has specific parameters. Labor arrest means that one must be at least 6 centimeters with their waters broken for at least 4 hours with, quote, adequate contractions, or at least 6 hours with, quote, inadequate contractions and no cervical change. During the second stage, first-time parents should push for at least 3 hours and all others for at least 2 hours before providers make the diagnosis of labor arrest. Further, ACOG is clear that there are no hard stops here as, quote, longer durations may be appropriate on an individualized basis. Now, there are plenty of women who receive their FTP diagnosis before 6 centimeters or because they didn't dilate a centimeter per hour. This diagnosis of FTP is not the current expected professional standard and not evidence-based, and yet it persists. So for providers who have a client with a history of labor arrest, it is prudent to review their records and compare what actually happened with ACOG's current definitions. You may find that they did not meet the criteria for labor arrest, and thus that box in the Grobman VBAC calculators should remain unchecked. Harris found that the Grobman 2007 and METS calculators are accurate when they predicted VBAC odds of greater than 60% in the specific population and location they studied. Harris's study asserts probabilities in this range can be communicated confidently to patients and their care providers to inform decisions. It looks like these calculators can predict VBAC accurately, even if they cannot do the opposite and predict repeat cesarean risk accurately. And we'll talk more about that later. This may encourage more birthing people to aptly plan a VBAC rather than opt for an elective repeat cesarean section. Although Harris demonstrates that the Grobman 2007 and METS calculators showed who has a good chance to have a VBAC, Harris explicitly states that these results are accurate only to their population. They recommend that other institutions study the model's calibrations in their population to choose the most accurate model for their patient population. End quote. So before providers can be assured these VBAC calculators will work in their community, they have to test each of them to determine which are the most accurate for the specific population they serve. Harris outlines the ways in which they tested the calculators, what statistical methods they used, and who they included. Providers are encouraged to replicate this study before they assume any of the three calculators will work for their patient population. And that is a really important thing to consider, is how the VBAC calculators were calibrated. They were created based on the statistics for a specific population in a specific location. That does not mean those findings are applicable to any population in any location around the world. And so that is why Harris says if you intend on using the VBAC calculator in your practice, you need to do the calibration and test its accuracy in the population that you serve. So let's talk about race and racism and how that impacts predicted VBAC odds. Now, it's true that race and ethnicity were removed from the Grobman VBAC calculator in 2021. But while preparing for this podcast, I wanted to see what was out there. So I Googled Grobman 2007 VBAC calculator and Grobman 2009 VBAC calculator. I got the same results with each Google search, and among the first 4 Google results, 3 didn't include race or ethnicity, but the 4th did. Beyond that, the belief that being Black or Hispanic negatively impacts VBAC odds can impact how these groups are counseled independent of the calculator. So it's important to understand where these beliefs of lower VBAC odds among people of color come from in order for us to counter them. So the original Grobman 2007 calculator deducted points if your client was Black or Latinx. This deduction for race and ethnicity may give birthing people of color an inaccurate perception of their VBAC odds. This deduction originates from the Grobman 2007 study, which reported the odds of Black and Latinx people having a VBAC as half of that of white people. However, these lower odds are less a reflection of one's innate ability to birth and more of a reflection of how institutionalized racism and implicit bias impacts the delivery of healthcare in the United States. As Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm said, racism is so universal in this country, the U.S., so widespread and deep-seated that it is invisible because it is so normal. We see that in the case of Serena Williams, who had to advocate for testing that could save her life when she experienced shortness of breath after her cesarean, and Lisa Kaiser, whose reports of postpartum pain after her cesarean were dismissed. On a larger scale, we see it in the collective experiences of Black women as reported by a 2004 study, quote, "The lifelong accumulated experiences of racial discrimination by African American women constitute an independent risk factor for preterm delivery. When Black people receive care from providers who look like them and where they are seen, heard, and respected, they have better healthcare outcomes and fewer complications." We see that very clearly in practices like Jenny Joseph's down in Florida. Since ACOG itself found that African American and Hispanic physicians are underrepresented in U.S. obstetrics, I suspect that the clinicians in the Grobman 2007 study were primarily white, and that could contribute to the purported lower VBAC rates among Black and Latinx communities. I wonder how many providers who use VBAC calculators regularly are aware of the lower VBAC odds that the Grobman VBAC calculators generate based on race and ethnicity, and that these lower odds stem from implicit bias. All involved with maternity care need to understand this dynamic so they can put predicted VBAC odds into perspective for their clients of color. Parents of color must know this truth so they can consider the Grobman VBAC calculator odds with a sizable grain of salt. A reader from New Jersey shares her experience. I'm Puerto Rican on the maternal side and German on my dad's. Under the old VBAC calculator, if I identify as white, I had 70% odds. If I selected Hispanic or Latino, I had 50% odds. People like myself with multiple heritages and ancestries were literally unintelligible to the algorithm until 2021. Today, with many Latino women having additional health conditions like diabetes or obesity, both things I've struggled with, the algorithm continues to punish women of color. OBs use it to mandate surgery for the most vulnerable and most disadvantaged. Like Cassandra crying out in the wilderness, birthing people, midwives, and doulas continue to call on obstetrics to stop hurting women. Is such a thing possible? Perhaps in another life there will be justice. And Rena from Maryland shared this. I was pursuing a vaginal birth after 2 cesareans in my last pregnancy. The provider I most often saw in a large, allegedly VBAC-promoting practice never mentioned the calculator. But towards the end, I met with a younger woman OB who insisted on using it. The appointment opened with her saying, I know you have lots of questions about whether you should have a cesarean again. My response to her was that I did not have any questions and had no concerns. I cited the research I had done and thought that would be the end of it. She basically used the calculator to try to bully me out of a VBAC. I didn't have my pre-pregnancy BMI. I'm a very average weight but high muscle mass person, so she used my 30-week BMI, even though the calculator clearly said pre-pregnancy. She was also very angry that she could no longer select race as a factor. As a Black American woman, I was grateful to see that bias be removed. But she must have spent 15 minutes trying to find a version of the calculator with race as a criteria. From there, it snowballed to the usual fear-mongering, but with a lot of palatable animosity, and claims that Black women aren't usually successful in VBAC. Also, this provider was a young Latina. I know most people might assume the doctor was white, but anti-Blackness comes from more than one direction. The entire appointment was abusive. But at the end, she noted I had something like a 50% chance and that I needed to schedule a C-section, or my uterus was probably going to rupture. Sadly, I met this same attitude in the hospital, and my preferred provider was unable to assist me. I had a third unnecessary cesarean after several days of harassment during what was supposed to be a mundane induction. I was never induced. From my experience, I think the calculator has been used to promote the existing biases providers have, which have nothing to do with the reality of a woman's actual body. As an aside, I made a formal complaint against this doctor's conduct. She's still there, and no one ever contacted me. End quote. So this right here is the problem. When racism is baked into the calculator and then fed back to us as, quote, science. Yes, it's great that race and ethnicity have been removed from the VBAC calculator. But as we can see here from Rena's story, people still get to contend with a provider's bias, independent of the calculator, and the fact that no one contacted her about her complaint. Which reminds me, if you do want to file a complaint, I highly recommend Birth Monopoly's resource entitled How to File a Complaint for Mistreatment in Maternity Care. I'll link to it in the show notes. A final comment from a midwife in San Diego. She said, I absolutely do not use the calculator. I find it prejudicial and racist. I have the privilege of working with many VBAC families every year. I have found it mostly inaccurate. So let's talk about BMI and the VBAC calculator. The Grobman VBAC calculators also subtract points for those with higher BMIs. Again, this is based on the Grobman 2007 study, which found that as BMI increases, the rates of VBAC decrease. But the thing to keep in mind here is that provider preference on whether to support or even offer VBACs to people of higher BMIs can impact who plans a VBAC. Prediction models are designed based on statistics of VBAC rates for people with high BMIs, which may be low due to provider preference. A 2013 study by Metz, spelled METZ, revealed that only 30% of good VBAC candidates actually chose to have a VBAC. And this dropped down to only 23% among those with a BMI of 30 or higher. So what could account for this difference? The authors suggest, quote, physicians may perceive that an intrapartum urgent cesarean would be more difficult in obese women with an increased risk of intraoperative injury and perinatal morbidity, end quote. As a result, we have no idea if VBAC candidates with higher BMIs were even offered a VBAC or what the conversation looked like. It seems the physicians may be counseling higher BMI patients away from planning VBACs. This leaves us with a challenge. Studies looking at VBAC rates by BMI may be underreporting the true potential VBAC rate, as VBAC is negatively influenced by provider preference about how to serve people with higher BMIs. We also have to look at what else didn't work in Harris's study. Surprisingly, the authors flat out did not recommend the use of the Grobman 2009 calculator at their institution, as its performance was deemed, quote, unacceptable. The other two remaining calculators, Grobman 2007 and Metz, quote, underpredicted actual success when predictions were less than 60%. Harris went even so far as to say that predicted odds of 20%, quote, may not be much different than odds of 50%. That is so important for clinicians and parents to hear and understand. The researchers warned, quote, therefore, it would not be beneficial and could potentially be harmful if these probabilities were used to make threshold decisions in this lower success range, end quote. In other words, when two of the three calculators generated high VBAC odds, they were typically correct. But when those same calculators estimated low VBAC odds, they were inaccurate. This is key because often those with high VBAC odds get a boost of confidence, and those with low VBAC odds could get a surgery date. If this tool is going to be used, everyone involved needs to be aware of its strengths and limitations, especially as it relates to its decrease in accuracy as predicted VBAC odds drop. Providers know how to use tools that only have a positive predictive value. They do it all the time with lab work. Some labs are more accurate in assessing risk for a condition than they are at providing reassurance or vice versa. In an effort to be completely transparent, the authors assert, quote, we plan to modify the displayed result of the calculator to report that, quote, this patient's predicted probability is less than 60%, and the model is not accurate in this range, end quote. Imagine if that showed up on the calculator. We also need to acknowledge that there are a variety of external factors completely out of the control of the birthing person that can significantly impact VBAC odds. These include provider VBAC rates, which reveals provider preference, hospital VBAC rates, which reveals overall VBAC climate, how L&D nurses perceive VBAC, whether they see it as a reasonable choice or a dangerous decision. Do people have freedom of movement? Do they have access to tools like peanut balls, water birth, medically indicated induction, and more? If we really wanted to measure an individual patient's VBAC odds, then we would have to include truly predictive information like the provider and/or hospital's VBAC rate. The fact is, if a provider isn't supportive of VBAC or a hospital bans VBAC, it is very unlikely a VBAC is going to happen, no matter how good that VBAC candidate looks on paper. And I need to say that I say it's very unlikely that VBAC will happen, but let me tell you, you always have the right to decline a C-section. And it doesn't matter what the hospital policy says. And your provider may have a recommendation, but people still have the right to make their own decisions. And the problem with tools like the VBAC calculator and policies like VBAC bans is that they really erode the trust that so many patients want to have in their clinicians, and yet the presence of these tools and policies makes them feel like, I can't trust you. So I think that's important for clinicians to hear. So what is the main takeaway from Harris's study? Providers and healthcare facilities around the world use VBAC calculators, and ACOG recommends their use in their 2017 and 2019 VBAC guidelines. But any predictive model should be part of a larger informed consent dialogue rather than the beginning and the end of a conversation. And while these models offer an opportunity for healthcare providers to counsel their patients on VBAC probabilities, it's important to keep their limitations in mind, especially when serving Black or Latinx birthing people, people with BMIs greater than 30, and those with a prior cesarean for labor arrest. These calculators more accurately identify who will achieve VBAC than those who won't. Additionally, these calculators tend to underpredict who will have a VBAC. That's a critical piece of information when the calculator returns odds of less than 60%. Now, Harris isn't the only study that found VBAC calculators underpredict. A 2020 study by Nguyen and team compared predicted VBAC odds for 567 Latinx women and people against actual VBAC rates, and found the predicted VBAC odds to be significantly lower than the actual rates. Using the patient's records and the Grobman 2009 VBAC calculator, the authors of this study put people into 3 groups divided by their predicted chance at a VBAC. They then compared those predictions to actual vaginal births during LACs. The low success group predicted VBAC rate was less than 35%, and their actual VBAC rate was more than 65%. The moderate success group with predicted VBAC odds of 35 to 65%, 84% had a VBAC. And the high success group, that was those who had VBAC odds predicted at over 65%, they actually had VBACs more than 91% of the time. Now, this is consistent with other studies that have compared predicted VBAC odds to actual VBAC rates. And as a result, they concluded that there is no good evidence that Latinx ethnicity reduces the chance of VBAC, and that higher BMI didn't explain the differences between predicted and actual VBAC rates. Most recently, a 2024 study by Ledbetter and team was conducted after race and ethnicity was removed from the VBAC calculator in 2021. And just a side note, they used the acronym LAC in their study for labor after cesarean rather than TOLAC, trial of labor after cesarean. And I want to thank the authors. No one wants to feel like their body is on trial, and I appreciate Ledbetter and team choosing to use the acronym LAC. It's more sensitive, and it focuses on what women and birthing people have control over, whether to labor or not, rather than what they don't, which is how their baby is ultimately born. I also appreciate that it takes the judgment out of birth, because trial of labor, it feels like a judgment. And it feels like then there is this success or failure. And I know even today I use those words success and failure, and that's something I'm working on. So I want you to know, we are all works in progress, right? Trying to undo this language from my mind and undoing this language in all of our minds so we can serve people more sensitively and with more empathy and care. That's part of growing in this work, whether you are a professional or you are an advocate. So another difference is the VBAC calculator that they chose to use, that Ledbetter chose to use. The calculator they chose was developed by the Maternal Fetal Medicine Network, and it uses a different combination of variables than the 3 calculators we have previously discussed. So rather than current weight, this VBAC calculator uses pre-pregnancy weight. It also collects whether someone has had a prior vaginal birth before their cesarean, a VBAC after their cesarean, or no prior vaginal birth. It asks if a prior cesarean was due to FTP, as well as if they have been treated for chronic hypertension. So again, you can see it took factors from all those 3 VBAC calculators and combined it into one. So I'll link to that VBAC calculator in the show notes. So if you think this whole conversation about VBAC calculators is straightforward, You can see it's not. So far, we've talked about 4 different calculators and how they all need to be calibrated for us to be able to see, does this calculator accurately reflect VBAC odds in the population that I serve? That's a question you should be asking if you're using the VBAC calculator. And again, Harris has details on how to calibrate the calculators in their full text of their study. Okay, so Ledbetter and team wanted to see how having a prior vaginal birth or not, coupled with body mass index in a Hispanic population, impacted predicted VBAC odds. Additionally, Ledbetter and team wanted to measure how low predicted VBAC odds impacted the number of people who labored after a cesarean. What did they find? Not surprisingly, those with a prior vaginal delivery were more likely to lack than those without a prior vaginal delivery. However, this next finding adds to the growing literature that VBAC calculators, no matter what variables they exclude and include, and no matter how we mash up all of these factors, they still underpredict VBAC odds. Ledbetter found that among those who are identified as overweight or obese per their BMI, meaning 25 or more for overweight or 30 or more for obese, the VBAC calculator underpredicted their VBAC odds. For those with BMIs between 25 and 30, their predicted VBAC odds were 72%, but 83% had a VBAC. For those with BMIs between 30 and 40, predicted VBAC odds were 70%, but again, 83% had a VBAC. And for those with BMIs greater than 40, the predicted VBAC odds were 58%, and again, 84% had a VBAC. And I want you to see how the predicted VBAC odds dropped dramatically as BMI increased. We saw how it was 72% for those who had BMIs between 25 and 30, and then from 30 to 40, it dropped to 70%, and then from more than 40, it dropped to 58%. And for those groups who had a BMI of greater than 25, 83 to 84% had a VBAC. This is incredibly encouraging news to larger-bodied people and reinforces the notion that VBAC odds are not determined by static patient information, but rather external factors including provider preference, VBAC bands, and lack of social support. Ledbetter and team concluded, quote, discouraging lack below 70% probability might have prevented 71 unsuccessful lacks, 160 initial VBACs, and 57 subsequent VBACs, decreasing the VBAC rate to only 39%. That is significant and an excellent mirror to what is happening right now across the U.S. Rebecca from Virginia shared this, quote, I'm currently expecting my second, due any day now. I wanted to set myself up for a successful VBAC, so I plan to give birth at a birth center with midwives. I'm 37 and overweight, gained weight shortly before my first pregnancy and never lost it. The midwife wanted me to see a maternal fetal medicine specialist just for a consult, since I had more risk factors, being older, overweight, and wanting a VBAC. Despite ultrasound looking great, baby being healthy, passing my diabetes screening, and great blood pressure, the maternal fetal doctor opened the VBAC calculator and it determines I had a 30% chance of success. My weight and a stalled labor with my first, now let's just take a step back, her weight and her stalled labor. We've talked about both of those factors. I wish that maternal fetal medicine specialist was listening to this podcast. If you know him, share this with him. And in fact, if you are listening to this podcast and you know a clinician who needs to hear it, or you know a parent who needs this information, share this podcast with them. Okay, back to her story. My weight and a stalled labor with my first probably being the biggest factors. In discussion there, she advised against, but said that she could point me to a provider who might induce at 39 weeks if I wanted to try for a VBAC. I wasn't concerned, having read about the risks, and wanted to move forward with my plan. I didn't expect to be blindsided by the maternal fetal doctor in their written recommendation to my birth center/midwives, that she advised I do not have a trial of labor at all, and if I insist that there will be tons of restrictions, baby not being large, being at a facility with 24/7 anesthesia coverage, etc. Because of that written recommendation, the midwives at the birth center felt I would be better served in a hospital setting. And so, at 30 weeks, I needed to find a new provider. They referred me to an OBGYN they consulted with, who basically told me he wouldn't support a VBAC unless baby was estimated at 6 pounds or less, and I had to go into labor spontaneously. FYI, my baby had been measuring large thus far. Okay, another side note. Baby measuring large, as I talk about in The Truth About VBAC for Families and The Truth About VBAC for Professionals, which is my signature training I presented around the country, as well as available online, the ability for us to accurately measure fetal weight before the baby is born is poor. It is very poor. And we have research to back that up. So I just want to plug that in here, because just because her baby was suspected to be large, when we look at studies of people who had their primary cesarean for fetal weight, and then we compare the estimated fetal weight to how much the baby actually weighed, these babies do not meet the criteria for a prophylactic cesarean for a large baby. And yet, these people had a primary cesarean due to suspected big baby. Now they carry that prior cesarean with them in all future pregnancies, and that's going to impact the options available to them, namely whether they have access to vaginal birth after cesarean or they're told their only option is a repeat cesarean. So we have to keep that in mind. Okay, back to her story. After a couple weeks, I eventually found a practice that was willing to support a TOLAC up to my due date, no inducing or augmenting, and would want to schedule a, quote, family-friendly C-section once I reach my due date, which I agreed to after thinking through my personal risk factors. Talking to the OBGYN there, she said if my body wants to birth this baby, they will be there to catch it. And she shared an experience she had early in her practice where someone had a less than 15% chance of having a VBAC, but they had a VBAC despite the odds. She said, 30% isn't great, but it's not zero. We'll see what happens. I'm at almost 38 weeks now. It has been difficult and devastating having to replan everything so late in my pregnancy, to try to build a relationship with new providers, all because of the VBAC calculator. This pregnancy has been going great, better than my first. Me and my baby have been healthy, great blood pressure, great blood sugar every time. I'm just older, overweight, and my first labor stalled, resulting in a C-section. And because a maternal fetal provider used the VBAC calculator and based their recommendation on it, no one wanted to touch me with a 10-foot pole. And I may end up needing a C-section, and that's okay if that's what's needed. I just wanted to be supported in letting my body labor. End quote. Look at how so much of what we discussed today is wrapped up in her lived experience. The lack of support because she's in a larger body, the lower predicted VBAC odds, how those low odds impacted the MFM's counsel. This is the harm that VBAC calculators cause. And I know it wasn't the intention of the people behind the calculator, and yet this is how this tool is used in real life. And this is why talking about the evidence behind VBAC calculators is so important. And I did reply to Rebecca's email and told her to listen to today's podcast so she could hear about this new study, which found that the VBAC calculator underpredicts VBAC odds among those with higher BMIs. I think trying to plan or not plan a VBAC based on the calculator and likelihood of success can be tricky. We are not just computers, just input data and get an output number. I think rather than typing into a calculator, it's better to talk about intended family size, personal values, why they want to plan a VBAC, and their understanding of risks and benefits. There are many, many factors that go into this decision-making process that the VBAC calculator does not even acknowledge. What about the prevalence of VBAC bans? What about the unaddressed trauma from past births, as well as fear based on misinformation that many clinicians carry? What about the fear of being sued and how that impacts how a provider discusses the option of VBAC? What about a group practice where only one physician or midwife attends VBAC and the rest opt out? And whether someone actually has an opportunity to VBAC or not all depends on who's on call when they go into labor. What about the incredible social pressure to just plan a repeat cesarean? Because no one gets a medal anyways, and it ultimately doesn't matter how your baby is born, which attempts to negate the fact that VBAC is an evidence-based mainstream option which national guidelines and medical evidence supports. What about the increasing risks that come with multiple prior cesareans, including placenta accreta spectrum, hysterectomy, which ends someone's fertility, and excessive bleeding, which obstetric hemorrhage is one of the leading causes of maternal mortality in the US and worldwide? That is something that always needs to be factored into the decision-making process. And this is why it is so problematic that ACOG's guidelines as of 2017 suggest VBAC calculators as a way to provide more specific information about the chances of having a VBAC. And I have to say, ACOG, if anyone from ACOG is listening, I would love to be involved with the development of your next practice guidelines for VBAC. Had I been at the table when those guidelines in 2017 were published, and I had been there for the conversation about including the VBAC calculator, I would have shared this information. I think it is so important to have consumers at the table. And me in particular, I carry experiences of hundreds of thousands of women and birthing people across the US through my almost 2 decades in this work. And I'm here to tell you, I know that the intention behind the VBAC calculator is not to gatekeep VBAC. I know the intention is to generate the best outcomes we can. But the reality is, it is often used to coerce people to have repeat cesareans. And I don't think a lot of providers understand the mechanics behind the VBAC calculators. I don't think they understand the shortfalls. And so when they communicate their predicted VBAC odds to families, families are left with these low VBAC odds and thinking, well, is it worth it to even try if I'm going to end up with a repeat cesarean? And as we can see from the studies we discussed today, that's just not the reality. So, ACOG, if you're listening, contact me. I would love to be on your committee to develop the next VBAC practice bulletin. And if you think I should be on that committee, reach out to ACOG and tell them. They need to hear how important it is to have people like me, and specifically me, on that committee. For all of these reasons, this is why it is so important for us to be very intentional anytime a VBAC calculator is used. If you are a clinician, ask yourself, why are you using this tool? How will it change how you counsel your patient? What will you do with the information? How will you explain what the VBAC calculator predicted odds means? How will you contextualize low predicted VBAC odds? How will you mitigate the potential negative impact of that number, given the studies that we have shared that have found that the VBAC calculator underpredicts? Okay, so here are my thoughts. First of all, I think we need to be very careful when using the VBAC calculator. But if you choose to use it, and if the calculator predicts low VBAC odds for your client, this is a time to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the VBAC calculator, along with specific factors that increase or decrease odds in its calculations, such as being Black, Latinx, having an FTP cesarean, or a BMI greater than 30. Included in the conversation should be the overall risks and benefits of VBAC and repeat cesarean to the birthing parent, their current pregnancy, and the parent's intended family size, keeping the physical and emotional risks of placenta accreta in mind. Better yet, discuss the validity of the calculators with patients before even using them, or discuss the validity and then don't use them. So that way, if your client stumbles across the VBAC calculator, they're already inoculated against the confusion that can result by plugging their data in. And also, we want parents to clearly know how much credit to give their predicted VBAC odds. Ultimately, the decision to plan a VBAC or not is in the hands of the birthing person, but the various social, cultural, political, and financial structures around them may vary greatly in whether they support or discourage VBACs. The prediction generated by a VBAC calculator is but one of many data points a pregnant person may consider when deciding how to have their baby. Now, don't forget, if you want to download a free handout on this topic, you can at vbacfacts.com/calculator. If you want to dive deeper into the research, I invite you to learn more with me. If you are a parent who wants to learn what the evidence really says about VBAC, so you can conquer your fears, eliminate confusion, and confidently make informed decisions without wasting thousands of hours on the internet, check out The Truth About VBAC for Families at vbacfacts.com/courses. If you are a birth professional who wants to learn more about the medical evidence on VBAC, so you can confidently provide families with the best support and VBAC education, then our VBAC Facts professional membership is for you. And don't forget, VBAC Facts is a nursing continuing education provider through the California Board of Registered Nursing. So all of our continuing education programming is approved for contact hours, and those contact hours are applicable to nurses, midwives, doulas, and a variety of other health and medical professionals whose licensing bodies accept nursing CEs. So you can learn more about professional membership at vbacfacts.com/membership. I also offer consulting for parents, birth professionals, those working on VBAC and maternal health policy throughout the U.S., as well as attorneys who have cases involving VBAC. If you want to bring me out to your community to offer a continuing education training, learn more at vbacfacts.com/speaking. And hey, while you're here, don't forget to leave a 5-star review. And if you know someone who would benefit from this information, share the podcast, share this episode. That's what it's all about. It is showing people what is possible relative to VBAC. It is possible to offer evidence-based care. It is possible to offer respectful healthcare. And it is possible to offer VBAC safely. So until next time, I'm Jen Kamel, VBAC Facts founder, and don't forget what we're about. Since 2007, our focus has been to provide accurate and objective information on vaginal birth after cesarean and repeat cesarean to parents, professionals, policymakers, and the court, so all decisions can be informed, ethical, and just. Until next time, take care.